Good afternoon. Welcome to the second session of our roundtable dealing with debt, external, internal debt and the sovereign debt. We will be talking about financial claims of the Czech Republic. Part of those claims is rooted in the times of the Czech-Slovak Socialist Republic, which within the frame of brethren cooperation supported countries of the Third World. Robert Stojanov will tell us something about the development over the last few decades and what should be the future development. So let me pass the floor to Robert Stojanov from Mendel's University in Brno. Good afternoon. Thank Tomáš for welcome. I thank Karolina for the organization, and I'm really very pleased that I can talk about this topic some 15 years after the first time Tomáš and I started studying this topic. We were a sort of investigators who were trying to find data. And at that time, the officials were not very vigilant, and they were giving us pieces of information. Some of them were secret, so we were able to put together a mosaic. But today they are much more vigilant. Today, paradoxically, the data are not as comprehensive as at that time, 13 years ago. Let me begin with what was mentioned by Tomáš. Let me introduce the development assistant of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. Later, the Czech Republic as an independent state. And after that, after this introduction, I will focus on the debts of developing countries in the Czech Republic. One of the milestones of the development of Czechoslovak development assistance was the beginning of the 70s, when Czechoslovakia realized at times of the beginning of social so-called normalization that this aid should generate some profit, because until that time it was really brutally help or assistance to developing countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia. And since the beginning of the 70s, Czechoslovakia begins to export turnkey projects and arms for money. At the beginning, it was a sort of barter trade in exchange of some agricultural products. But as I repeat, from the 70s, these are commodities that are exported to developing countries by the government with the aim of profit, either financial or in the form of oil or some other natural minerals, or, as I mentioned, agricultural products, fruits. Czech development assistance or aid comes into existence in 1993, when the Czech Republic came into existence. During the 90s, the Czech Republic was for a short time a recipient of the development assistance. The World Bank and the European Development Bank were sending money with the goal to build infrastructure in this country. Social infrastructure, for example, building of non-governmental organizations and their capacities, that would be counterparts of the Western countries, or projects that were supposed to raise environmental awareness and improve environmental situation in the Czech Republic. At the end of the 90s, the ODA is standardized, and from 2004, when the Czech Republic joined the EU, Czech Republic is supposed to pay a certain fee to the budget of the EU, so it is becoming a mandatory expense. As a result of joining the EU, Czech Republic also has an obligation. From 2010, the ratio between ODA and GNI was supposed to be 0.17%. In 2015, it was supposed to be 0.33%. Both goals or targets have not been met until today. The Czech Republic in 2017 was fulfilling this obligation at the level of 0.13%. In absolute figures, we can see a sort of growth from £500 million at the end of the 90s to 6.3 billion crowns in 2017. So that is positive. However, if we look at the ratio between ODA and GNI, you see that between 2008 and 2017, that is the last decade, the development was not significant. In fact, it has not been changing. We should take into account one significant moment. The Czech Republic has been in its best economic condition in its history over the last 3 years. So it was an ideal time to increase this assistance in absolute figures, but also in relative figures. However, I'm afraid it hasn't happened. You saw the mild drop. During the last 15 years, the Czech official aid began to focus on meeting the development targets. And they were projects that were supposed to deliver. And the target was 2015. After 2015, the development projects were targeted to other targets that are the targets of sustainable development. At the same time, however, we established the Czech Development Agency. I forgot to mention that this organization came into existence with the aim to distribute money to bilateral projects between the Czech Republic and individual countries, or trilateral projects. This development agency began to be very much focused on these projects to be realized, implemented by private companies, which were supposed to enter the markets in developing countries via these projects. In fact, this is a comeback to the turn of the century, because there were ministries who were responsible for individual projects, and the ministries were giving the money to private companies. For example, the Ministry of Industry and Economy. And however, the companies were not delivering any added value, similarly to the Ministry of Agriculture. And however, the development or sustainable or long-term effect was not known. If you look at the statistics of 2016 regarding bilateral aid, more than 1/4 of the projects were directed to the Balkans and Eastern Europe, then Middle East and Northern Africa, then Southern and Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and other Asian states and Pacific region. Let me get back to the privatization of bilateral projects. I have an impression, it's my subjective impression, it's not evidence-based, that what was built over the 10 years between 2005 to 2015, when a number of projects was implemented by the civic society, by non-governmental organizations, did not deliver because they were different with their results. They were different from the projects implemented by the private companies. Let us look at the key topic of my presentation. That is the debt with the Czech Republic. Let's get back to the Czechoslovakia, socialist Czechoslovakia. The main reason for the support was, or financial aid, was the support of allies. It was a support of friendly governments. I'm not saying countries, but either political groupings or individuals of those countries with the aim to expand socialism all over the world. This was, of course, under the influence of the Soviet Union, which distributed this development aid and determined which of the partners of the socialist bloc would serve which country. As regards Czechoslovakia, it was one of the industrially most developed countries of the communist bloc. It was turnkey projects, building of factories, power plants, and other industrial facilities, and also export of arms and other military materials, so-called special materials. So these turnkey projects were really built and exported. There were also other projects like food assistance and building of hospitals, supporting the education of the staff of hospitals. The end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s was the time when the relations with these countries changed completely, and Czechoslovakia stopped providing these loans from 1991, with the exception of, for example, Belarus. Well, there was a big effort not to relieve debts in general. And this ended up in the following, that the Czech governments tried to make new deals with, or enter into new deals with partner governments and to find some alternative forms of solution. At the beginning of the 90s and later, most of those debts were sold to private companies, Czech as well as foreign. For example, to such countries like Cyprus. Cyprus is considered a country which is not completely transparent in terms of financial issues. None of the Czech governments did not incline to relieve or to exempt the countries from the debts, because selling these debts to private companies was not for free. It was balanced by the following. The Czech Republic was supposed to get up to 25% of that amount, and the rest was kept by the company. Other countries, not only of Western Europe, but also of the Visegrad 4, that is Central and Eastern Europe, they took another path. Tomáš mentioned it. They participated in initiatives which were supposed to reduce the debt led by IMF or World Bank. The Czech Republic did not participate almost in these initiatives and was selling these loans to private companies, although the yield would be at the same level. And then this money could be included in official aid. So in moral terms, it would be better for the Czech Republic. This is an example which really is very often mentioned, and it's a bizarre example. It was a loan provided to Peru. Peru was supposed to repay 40 million crowns to the account of Czech bank. 40 million crowns was about $2 million American dollars. Peru did so. Peru repaid the money without anybody noticing this. The Deputy Minister of Finance, Mr. Zelinka, sold this loan to Amper company and keep 95%. 5% was supposed to go to the Czech Republic, 95% to the company, depending on the size of the recovery of the debt. The moment when these data, this information was published, company Amper published that it was their deal, and although they didn't do anything, and they really received 95%, only later there was an audit. And it was found out that the money was on that account much longer than Amper really came up with it. So the Ministry of Finance sued two owners of the company. One of the owners died and the other left the country, and two left the country.
So far, about several tens of millions were recovered while selling their facilities and their property. But the litigation continues, so if you count in what was spent on the court, probably it would be better than the 5% rate. So that's one example showing. For example, selling the Russian debt to Falcon company. I shall skip that one because it would be too long. When we look at the statistics of the claims, between 1999 and 2000, these claims were over $2 billion. crowns, which was about $8 billion US. And then there was a decrease in 2004. It was 43 billion crowns, less than 2 billion USD. Here, the Russian debt came into play. It was at about 100 billion Czech crowns, and that was sold to the Vulcan company. The reluctance to pay back or even recognize the claims in many countries such as Cuba, Kazakhstan, former Yugoslav states, but also China, North Korea, Sudan, Libya and others, showed another development, that the further decrease of the foreign debt was slowed down. The countries I named never recognized an existence of claims. They have various pretexts saying that the situation has changed, that this was obtained from the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, which no more exists, so the debt does not exist. Or Kazakhstan, they say we do not recognize, it's a question for Soviet Union and their successors, legal successors, Russia. There were some agreements concluded with former Yugoslav states. For example, part of the loan paid back by Slovenia, that was about 5 million crowns. Serbia recognized its debt, and some paying back is going on. What is interesting that at least the civilian part of the debt was repaid by Syria just before the civil conflict started there. There is still remains higher sum. We do not know about it officially, but unofficially we know it's over 4 billion Czech crowns. That was for weapons and trucks for the Syrian army in the late 80s and early 90s. Countries like Laos, Myanmar or Burma started to repay. We already spoke of Peru, and we have agreements with Nicaragua, Cambodia, and others. In Nicaragua, more than 90% of the debt was eliminated. Iraq, it was over 60%, and Cambodia were also relieved. I think it was 70 or 75% of the debt. The example of Nicaragua or Cambodia could be used as an example how elimination and repayment could be combined. The amounts paid were used in a double manner because they were used for funds that should help develop the countries further. Nicaragua, for example, made a promise that the part that will not be repaid will be used to protect environment in the country, which is an ideal state of affairs. I would say it's a win-win strategy. When you look at what the indebtedness looked like 15 years ago when we issued our first report, you can see that in 2004, it was by the end of 2005, it was 20 billion Czech crowns, without counting Belarus and Russia without including the former Yugoslav states. So we calculated or found out, doing the investigation I mentioned, we found out about the amount. I will later show you a table saying that countries like North Korea, Cuba, Libya were not mentioned at all. Tomáš said that the Czech Republic is one of the biggest scrimps in Europe. It eliminated as little as possible. The Czech government, Czech cabinets, whether left-wing or right-wing or even caretaker cabinets, agreed that the debts would be sold to private companies instead of being eliminated. So you can see we relieved countries of the former Eastern Bloc by 15 billion on Bulgaria, eliminated 5 times as much of its foreign debt, and I think that's really a shame. It's shameful. When we look at the situation now, the responsibility for the elimination of that is borne by Ministry of Finance. I can't remember exactly the year when the Czech cabinet took all the debt together and said that the Ministry of Finance will be in charge of registering the debts and their recovery. Some of the debts, however, need recognition and then some agreement on the schedule of repayment, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs must take part because they have diplomats there. Most of the debts are still in force. Now the table is 15 years old. The problems with the private companies, I mentioned those, a number of them, even if they recovered a debt, then they did not pay even the small amount to the Czech Republic that was agreed. So there are quarrels there, for example, with the company from Cyprus. And there are still contentions with a Swiss company. So probably the agreements were not formulated in legal terms very well. In terms of the so-called special technology, the new regime in Iraq that came into being after the war there, it was agreed that 55% of this loan will be eliminated. Then the amount was published. We know how much was eliminated, but the rest is being paid back by Iraqis. But also Cuba and Libya got such a loan on special technology, and so did Syria. We still don't know how much was repaid, but in terms of Libya, the Czech Republic now says we have no partner to talk to. And the diplomacy is right there. The reluctance to eliminate that continues, though the Czech Republic is in the best, historically the best economic state. So there are some regimes that had for democracy should be supported. For example, such a win-win strategy as was used in Nicaragua is no more repeated. I'm coming to the end of my presentation. In 2010, it was 1.5 billion. In 2017, there was an increase, and the reason is, as this table shows, prepared by Tomáš, a number of countries, such as Cuba, rejected flatly to recognize the claim. And the interests increased the amount several times. In Cuba, however, there was a slight shift. The Cuban side recognized that such claim exists, but we must still negotiate how big it is. A number of those loans were concluded in the 1980s in virtual currency. We already had a virtual currency, and its transfer into euros or dollars is very problematic. So the calculation still has not been done. That would be agreed by both parties. The Cuban side, similar to North Korea, want a commitment on the side of the Czech Republic that the Czech Republic will eliminate the debt, and then they will recognize. North Korea said that we will negotiate when the Czech Republic promises to relieve us of 95% of the debt, and the remaining 5% will be used to train workers and engineers in the Czech Republic. So those were two bizarre examples of what happens at negotiations. There are two major conclusions. What attitude should we take towards dictatorial or authoritarian regimes, such as North Korea? Should we eliminate? We know that these are bad debts. But to eliminate, saying that 95% will be eliminated and the rest will be used to train your people in the Czech Republic, which certainly would not lead to democracy in your country, that's not possible. China owes several hundreds of millions of Czech crowns. They simply don't want to pay. Kazakhstan is the same. They recognize the debt. President Nazarbayev, when Czech President Klaus was there, President Nazarbayev again said that we know nothing of the debt. So should we, is it moral to not to require repayment or wait until the situation changes in the countries? And we also discussed usage of private companies. The path taken by the Czech Republic was that debts were sold to private companies instead of being eliminated in the countries from whom the money had to be recovered. Probably there was something behind it that is not visible to the broad public. For the Czech Republic, the recovery rate would be the same, would have been the same. So probably there are some other private interests that come into play, and we do not know what they are. So that's it from me, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, for your presentation. If you have any questions, it's the time to raise them. Zazvorkova, from the Czech Forum for Development Cooperation. I would like to have a short comment and a question. The Czech Forum for Development Cooperation associates 40 non-governmental organizations. I would like to say, yes, as regards privatization, we see the increase of different instruments for private sector, but we also try to defend the role of non-governmental organizations. Fortunately enough, they are not dependent only on funds from the Czech Development Agency. That's good. And now the question concerning those two challenges. What's the position of other countries of the EU? How do they address the issue of debts with the countries with dictators or authoritarian regimes? Thank you for your comment as well as for the question. I will be talking about, or I will be trying to reply. Well, their position differs. For example, Spain, thanks to long-term contacts with Cuba, Spain had diplomatic relations with Cuba for a long time, and the negotiations were going on, and the Cuban side recognized, and the Spanish side eliminated the debts. So the relations were much more open between Spain and Cuba than in Czech and Cuba. The United States, it's a specific case. The superpower politics and policy plays a very important role. The debts are recognized and eliminated depending on what is suitable for the moment, how well it matches certain summits and congresses and so on. So, and as far as I know, France and the UK were quite responsible towards the initiatives Tomáš was speaking about. The United Kingdom, they had this initiative to relieve the debts of Africa. It was under Tony Blair. It was under Tony Blair as the Prime Minister. However, reality was different. For me, it was a positive message that very important decision makers, including Prime Minister, really take it into account. The United Kingdom did not relieve all the debts with African countries, but quite a lot of them. But has anybody heard anything like this in the Czech Republic? I'm talking about the executive powers. For example, Czech Prime Minister, would he support, for example, activists like Jubilee, and would say this is a correct initiative, we should take this path, but we have to introduce some rules and conditions, exempt these regimes, something like that. I don't remember. I don't think a minister or prime minister would have ever said anything like that. I would like to make a comment. Vladimir Špidla, when he was the prime minister, he spoke about debt relief of Iraq. However, the initiative was launched. However, it didn't end up well. But this was under pressure of the United States. It was not a Czech initiative. There was a huge pressure of the United States that was exerted on all creditors of Iraq. Yes, Prime Minister Špidla was a good Prime Minister. Minister Kavan, when we organized the original Jubilee campaign, he was very helpful. And he personally supported the initiatives, but I don't think the public knew about it. Yeah, we really are not good at this. Well, you mentioned the pressure, and you mentioned that under socialist regime we were simply ordered whom to support. And the Czechoslovak Republic was also directed to be very harsh with Cuba. That's why the negotiations are so difficult, unlike Spain, because there in Spain there was there was this pressure exerted by the United States on human rights, so to support human rights. I have a question. Heron, it would be for you, if I can. You said, and you showed how debt increases, how it grows of Caribbean island countries, and what's the relation to the climate change, and the occurrence of more frequent natural disasters, hurricanes, and so on. And you also said that the governments of those countries need to get loans to be able to rebuild the houses or structures. You mentioned also government buildings, schools, roads. I can imagine that these are destroyed. But I would like to know, what is the role of development banks or the institutions, financial institutions, that provide these loans? Because they borrow money on the activity which does not bring any profit. So to repair the school or government building or road, or for building more resilient structures and other infrastructure, means that this will not generate any financial profit or effect that I could then use to repay the debt. So what's the position of these financial institutions? You mentioned IMF, World Bank. You also mentioned Chinese government. So what is their position? What is their role? And what is their responsibility? They must know that they are lending money which the state cannot repair.
The Caribbean islands, for example, with the new measures that have just been put in place, apply to borrow money from organizations, other banks, other countries, and they get it. Most of the islands there, and in my updated presentation, I'll include a slide, their debt is more than GDP. So it appears, I admit I'll have to do some more research, it appears that there isn't much in terms of restrictions. You know, they're more than willing actually to say, here, we'll loan you this to rebuild, or you need X amount of money and we'll loan it to you. So in the Caribbean, most of the islands, debt is high. And I apologize for not having a slide to show you just where it is compared to GDP, but I will send it to Carolina. I will. Yes. And hopefully you can get it from her. So in terms of, for example, saying, oh, well, you're already at 80% capacity, so I'm sorry, we can't borrow you any more money. I've never heard of a case where that happened. If the islands need money for whatever reason, they get it. And if it's not from an organization such as the IMF, it comes from another country. Yes? So, for example, I know Barbados has most of its debt from organizations like IMF rather than from other countries. In Grenada, we have from organizations and other countries. We have a lot of bilaterals. So it ranges from one island to the next. So there's no umbrella structures. You say, for example, debt of the Caribbean islands comes from Eastern Caribbean Bank or the Caribbean Development Bank. Each island's mix of debt would be different in terms of whether it's from an international organization or it's from another country.
Does it mean that there is no responsibility? I mean, these international financial institutions or Chinese government or other governments. They do not examine whether the country is able to repay. Because if I want to take a loan to build a house, the bank will examine my case, and if I do not repay, they take the house from me and they saturate. But these financial institutions, they have to know in advance that Grenada or some other Caribbean state is not able to repay the debt. So these countries will become dependent on those institutions. Grenada government knows that will not repay. And does this government expect that it will be relieved? Is it written somewhere in between the lines, or is it just assumed that this will happen?
During my research, I came across this one sentence. It says that when organizations such as the IMF is not willing, or when they feel that an island has too much debt, there's a long line of other places, sometimes private loan, offering loans to the islands. So, I don't know what their motivation is behind it, but there are a lot of private loan creditors, a lot of private creditors who are targeting small countries. So one way or the other, we get money. And in most instances, it's not a matter of paying it back now. Sometimes you get a loan. So let's say Grenada gets a loan in 2019. It doesn't have to start repaying it for 5, 10 years. So you pay interest, and then you start making the bigger payments in a few years down the road. So the loan is given on the basis that it will help to improve the economy. The economy improves in 10 years. It will be in a much better position because the funds that you would have received from this loan should improve it in a lot of ways that by that time it will be paid back, or the country will have the capability to pay it back. Yes.
I would like to add that a large part of those loans are speculative loans. Let us realize that most of those loans are not repaid in national currencies. They are repaid according to the agreement in dollars or euros. So the changes in the exchange rate also change the size of the debt in the course of years. That's one thing. The second thing is that if we look at the course of the development historically, I do not remember the figures, but let's say theoretically country X got a loan at the level of $20 million, repaid $30 million in 5 years, and $40 million is still indebted. So it is not a loss for the institution. Although the debt grew and the creditor can be taken for somebody who suffers, but that's not true, because unlike your house, which you can set on fire in the worst case, but the country simply will live, and unless you are at war, you won't put the country on fire. Well, this provision of loans to the governments is a very advantageous situation, and it is in fact irresponsible behavior, and that's the campaign in 2000 drew attention to this. What we see as a challenge now is that at the international level, there is no independent referee unit that would be addressing these problems.
it is being solved on a bilateral or multilateral level or by only the big creditors, and the rest, the small ones, have to adapt. The big private creditors have their own clubs in which they discuss things. Then, of course, there are double taxation clauses or protection of investment clauses. You can sell the debt on the so-called secondary market, which is something as money laundering. It's taken as being immoral. So you sell in the secondary market, and the private company can then refer to protection of investment and take them to arbitration court so as to recover the money. If they don't, using the agreement means they can seize a property in the countries in question, in countries of WTO, and that will limit them. I'll just recall Czech Republic that nearly lost some valuable pictures or valuable musical instruments which were out of the country in an exhibition or with the National Philharmonic Orchestra, and these multinationals tried to seize those goods until we have an independent committee that will make decisions on legality of loans that will increase the responsibility on the part of the creditors. We will never get out of the situation, and we will be forced to things mentioned by Robert and Haron. For example, social and medical care problems that cannot be solved through loans. We have to make social investment. And that means a totally different model of international cooperation.
If I can add, organizations such as the IMF, periodically they will go to each country to look at, so they send their own team and we get audited. So we look at how we're repaying, what we're doing with the monies, and countries, the Caribbean islands, will not like to, do anything that would harm the relationship that we have with IMF. Therefore, we're loaned money on the premise that we will repay it just because of the character that we have in the relationship that we'd like to maintain. Yes.
Yes, in fact, that's the principle of all big creditors that want to keep people on or want to be profitable. That means recollecting interests all the time. And one thing that intrigued me was that the requirement for a moratorium is really a small requirement. And it's shocking that the creditors don't want to agree. Is there a debate in the Caribbean region of remission or elimination of the debts? Former colonial relations discussed? Is climate change discussed? And are there any claims to the climatic fund that, apart from the moratorium, is there a possibility for the indebted countries to seek elimination, total elimination of the debts? Is that being discussed, or does it happen in the Caribbean countries? And the second question was, do you try to get some support from the climate fund, which was established after the Paris Conference on Climate to, in fact, care about the damages that poor countries suffer?
To answer the first question, it is, at the moment when we have CARICOM heads of meetings, so every year there's a different chairman of CARICOM, and it rotates between the prime ministers of the different islands. So it goes to all the different islands. And whenever they have their meetings, each prime minister will raise certain issues. Recently, over the past few years, the main issue that has been raised is debt and debt relief. So on a regional level, it is being spoken about. However, on an international level, it hasn't been picking up any traction yet. So as time goes on, hopefully, as we keep speaking about it and going to international meetings and bringing it, out there and, letting everyone know letting everyone know what is happening, what we're trying to do, we're hoping that would help. But on a regional level, yes, it has been spoken about. It is being spoken about at regional heads of government meetings. Just recently, in January, I had to do a piece to write a paragraph to be included in the speech that our Prime Minister was going to make at the CARICOM head of meeting. I know Jürgen did something for the Prime Minister of Barbados as well. So regionally, yes. Your second question, my short-term memory, you asked. Yes. So after, pardon? Yes. Yes. So after the last meeting of the Climate Fund, yes, is when we went ahead and created a new ministry. So in Grenada now we have a Ministry of Climate Resilience, and their main focus is to create relationships with these international organizations and to get funding to fight climate change and the effects of climate change in the Caribbean. At the moment, we're the only one. However, we're hoping that the other islands will create their own ministries of climate resilience. Yes. It's pretty small. We only have a minister, a permanent secretary, and an office person. So it started last year. It's only a staff of 3 for now. The office person is one of my friends, so I know personally for a fact that she's been to quite a few international meetings. She was in Germany, actually, just last year. So, we're working on it. However, I feel personally, by myself, and I think a lot of people in the Caribbean would agree, that even though we're all islands and we're all different, at the end of the day, we're all one. And in order to get a voice outside, then we'll have to come together and make one strong voice instead of having each island doing a little voice here, like a whisper here and a whisper there. Maybe we should just all come together and do a shout. That's how I feel about it, but yes.
Thank you. The time's up, more or less. I want to thank Haren for coming. I think it's important for us because we have to realize the mere size of the catastrophe that faces us. Forming one community of people on the planet, we have to search for common solutions without leaving all in the hands of those who only are motivated by greed. It's good to remind ourselves of such things and search for new systemic steps to put the injustice right that exists in the world. We could continue for hours. I want to thank Robert for the study he presented. This is the first draft that we gave you. In a stronger form, it will be published later. It was first written in English. We had to make it Czech, but not always did it go through right in the print. And it will be updated when we get more data. The presentation done by Haran will be put on the websites of organizations who participated in this roundtable, and we also want to make an article. We will tell you about it. Thank you, Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, who helped us. I want to thank the Ecumenical Academy, who, assisted by the means of the European Union, took part in this international project. And similar comparative studies will be also published in other EU countries, showing the path we are going to take from here. Thank you for coming. We still have some snacks and we have some time for informal exchange of information. And I look forward to meeting you again in projects of the Ecumenical Academy.